In 1965, the United States embarked on a military campaign unlike any in its history. Over 500,000 troops, armed with unprecedented firepower, descended into the dense jungles of Vietnam. But this was no ordinary war. Against an elusive enemy willing to endure unimaginable hardships, the Americans soon found themselves locked in a grinding conflict, where every metric of success came under question, and every victory seemed to fuel deeper challenges. This is the story of a war shaped by staggering technological advances, relentless guerrilla tactics, and a clash of ideologies that stretched far beyond the battlefield. From the jungles of Ia Drang to the shadowy tunnels of the Viet Cong, discover how strategies, weapons, and politics collided in a conflict that would redefine warfare and test the limits of a nation's resolve. In 1965, tens of thousands of U.S. troops were deployed to Vietnam to engage in war. Supported by B-52 bombers, helicopters, and napalm, many anticipate that the Viet Cong guerrillas will collapse under the overwhelming firepower of the U.S. However, in Vietnam's dense jungles and treacherous swamps, the Americans soon find that combat is a grueling and relentless struggle, with high casualties and limited opportunities to strike first. During the summer of 1965, 50,000 U.S. troops arrived in South Vietnam under the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV. The United States hopes that its soldiers and air power will pressure North Vietnam to withdraw its backing of the Viet Cong insurgency, which aims to destabilize the South Vietnamese government. Nevertheless, the U.S. strategy emphasizes a gradual approach, relying primarily on air attacks. By late 1964, the United States had already begun covertly bombing North Vietnamese supply routes in Laos, and in 1965, these efforts escalated with Operation Rolling Thunder targeting North Vietnam. Despite this escalation, the U.S. avoids striking primary targets like Hanoi, aiming instead to coerce North Vietnam into negotiating terms favorable to South Vietnam. President Lyndon B. Johnson's objective is not to achieve territorial conquest or outright victory, but to prevent North Vietnam from overpowering the South. However, North Vietnam refuses to negotiate as long as foreign troops remain in South Vietnam. As a result, the conflict becomes defined by continued combat rather than diplomatic compromise. General William Westmoreland faces the daunting task of devising a strategy to expel the North from South Vietnam while minimizing political and military costs for the United States. His challenges are compounded by political constraints that restrict ground operations to South Vietnam. President Johnson categorically rules out a conventional invasion of North Vietnam to avoid provoking Chinese intervention, as occurred during the Korean War. Johnson also vetoes any attempt to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and Cambodia, aiming to limit the scope of ground operations. However, this decision hampers Westmoreland's ability to isolate the battlefield effectively. Within South Vietnam, U.S. leaders consider two potential strategies: traditional large-scale combat operations, or a counterinsurgency approach focused on small unit tactics and winning over the South Vietnamese populace politically. Although some advocate for counterinsurgency, Westmoreland concludes it would require more troops and would leave the Viet Cong in control of the conflict's pace. Instead, he opts for a strategy of annihilation, leveraging U.S. superiority in mobility and firepower. His plan is to engage the Viet Cong directly in large decisive battles, inflict heavy casualties, and force North Vietnam to abandon its support for the insurgency. This strategy relies on rapid attritional warfare. Under this plan, U.S. forces will not aim to secure territory permanently, but will conduct relentless search and destroy missions. These operations involve methodical sweeps through villages and hamlets, searching for Viet Cong fighters and their resources. For instance, during one operation, soldiers systematically move house by house, focusing on identifying military-age men who may belong to the Viet Cong. So far, the scene reveals only women, children, and elderly men. This approach represents a significant institutional shift within the Department of Defense. Under the direction of Secretary Robert McNamara, The DoD implements new statistical and quantitative management techniques inspired by practices in the business sector. Every aspect of the war is meticulously measured to evaluate progress and pinpoint the critical moment when North Vietnam will no longer be able to sustain its efforts. Analysts and officers track everything from bomb tonnage to minor items like tent pegs, but the most crucial metric is the body count of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces killed during U.S. operations. Since this conflict is not judged by territorial gains like many traditional wars, the body count becomes the primary measure of success. As a result, the Pentagon pushes U.S. commanders to achieve higher kill and capture counts to align with Westmoreland's overarching strategy. This emphasis on kill counts broadens the original passive defensive role of U.S. forces. Now, troops are expected to take the offensive, actively seeking out and engaging the Viet Cong, supported by an array of newly introduced firepower. The ideal search and destroy mission involves identifying a Viet Cong unit through intelligence and reconnaissance, quickly deploying ground forces to pin the enemy down, and escalating the battle to draw in more adversaries. Once engaged, U.S. troops call in airstrikes and artillery to deliver a decisive blow. While similar tactics had been employed previously by the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN, American commanders attributed their lack of success to the perceived shortcomings in ARVN troops' fighting capabilities, rather than flaws in the strategy itself. To bolster their efforts, U.S. forces are equipped with advanced tools, vehicles, and weapons. Beginning in 1964, U.S. Army soldiers were issued the 5.56 mm M16 rifle to replace the heavier 7.62 mm M14. Although not universally well received, the M16 is touted for being lighter, more controllable in automatic fire, and capable of carrying more ammunition, all critical advantages in jungle combat, where engagements occur at shorter ranges and resupply missions are challenging. Combined with the M60 machine gun and M79 Thumper grenade launcher, U.S. platoons aim to unleash overwhelming firepower against the comparatively lightly armed Viet Cong. Arguably the most vital piece of equipment for any platoon is the radio, which serves as the lifeline for calling in reinforcements, airstrikes, or artillery support. Given the challenging terrain of South Vietnam, which includes jungle-covered highlands and swampy deltas, traditional ground transport is often impractical. To navigate these environments, a fleet of patrol boats and hovercrafts form a brown water navy to operate along the rivers. Meanwhile, advancements in military aviation, particularly with helicopters, provide unprecedented mobility. The UH-1 Iroquois, commonly known as the Huey, replaces the bulky Shawnee and becomes a defining symbol of the Vietnam War. The Huey plays a multifaceted role, being used for troop insertions and extractions, medical evacuations, resupply missions, and close air support. In fact, Hueys account for about a third of the 36 million helicopter sorties flown throughout the conflict, highlighting their pivotal role in the war effort. U.S. jet aircraft, including the F-4 Phantom and A-4 Skyhawk, are introduced to provide rapid close air support, often employing napalm and white phosphorus, while the AC-47 Spooky gunship, armed with multiple miniguns, offers sustained overhead firepower for hours. Helicopters also proved to be a game-changer in the early stages of the conflict. During the Battle of Ia Drang, in November 1965, air assault troops inflict significant losses on North Vietnamese Army, NVA, forces entering Vietnam from Cambodia. While the NVA launches several close-range assaults on U.S. landing zones, American firepower forces them to retreat, bolstered by the first tactical deployment of B-52 bombers. Although the majority of the NVA manages to escape, the U.S. 1st Air Cavalry Division reports a 10-to-1 kill ratio, appearing to validate both air assault tactics and Westmoreland's overall strategy. Initially, the presence of helicopters has a profound psychological effect on North Vietnamese troops. One soldier, Nguyen Quang Sang, recalls, "When helicopters spotted us, we had to run for our lives. It was terrifying. Once when a helicopter dropped down especially close, I even saw the face of the door gunner. That was the first time I ever saw an American. I'm still haunted by it in my nightmares. By the end of 1965, the US can claim to have stabilized South Vietnam and shifted the momentum against the enemy. Yet the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces quickly adapt. The heavy losses sustained at Ia Drang prompt the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong to shift their focus back to guerrilla warfare. This shift is driven not only by practical considerations, but also by a keen understanding of the US political landscape. North Vietnamese General Secretary Le Duan observes that America's military strength in Vietnam is weakened by a lack of public and political resolve back home. Le Duan explains, "We can fight a protracted war while the US can't. Although the US can immediately send 300,000 to 400,000 troops, why must they do it step by step? Because of fear of a protracted war and stronger opposition from the American people and the world's people." In response, the Viet Cong took the lead in the South, employing strategies that had previously worked against the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. In 1963, US General Frank Osmansky detailed the Viet Cong's resourceful tactics, noting their use of non-explosive weapons such as caltrops, spike traps, poison darts, and even enraged water buffaloes. Their endurance, patience, and ingenuity are also formidable weapons. They are known to endure weeks in dark tunnels, breathe through hollow reeds to remain submerged for extended periods, and lie in ambush for up to 48 hours. The Viet Cong adopt sniping, mines, and booby traps as their primary means of attack. Mines are particularly effective, as they often maim rather than kill, depleting US resources and morale. Their expertise in staging ambushes grows, with a focus on eliminating officers and radio men to prevent US forces from calling in air support. These ambushes are typically swift, lasting only a few minutes, but their devastating impact underscores the Viet Cong's adaptability and tactical prowess. These tactics are supported by streamlined logistics. A Viet Cong soldier typically carries as little as 5 kilograms of gear during combat, compared to the 40 kilograms that burden US soldiers. Additionally, the North Vietnamese are able to source supplies locally from supportive or coerced villagers. They can also blend into the civilian population, relying on irregular supporters to perform tasks like laying mines, conducting labor, or scavenging unexploded US ordnance for reuse. Extensive tunnel networks, some running directly beneath US bases, enable the Viet Cong to infiltrate, evade detection, and protect both personnel and equipment from US firepower. Working alongside the Viet Cong is the Regular People's Army of Vietnam, commonly known as the North Vietnamese Army, NVA. With the help of political indoctrination, propaganda, and mandatory conscription, the NVA rapidly expands, armed with modern Soviet and Chinese equipment. Over time, NVA units achieve firepower comparable to US squads, wielding weapons like the AK-47 automatic rifle, RPD machine gun, and rocket-propelled grenades. While the Viet Cong often rely on WI2-era armaments, they also receive modern equipment transported through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Moreover, Soviet and Chinese allies bolster North Vietnamese defenses against bombing with engineering troops, anti-aircraft systems, and advanced fighter jets like the MiG-21. North Vietnamese ace pilot Lu Huai Chau explains his confidence after his first victory. "Once I had shot down an F-4, I was no longer scared of any type of American aircraft. The psychological factor is very important in any battle. Part of my confidence came from knowing that if I had to bail out, I would be landing in my own country." The North Vietnamese adopt a strategy of engaging only on favorable terms, often neutralizing US technological superiority with patience and surprise. Despite the dominance of helicopters in news coverage, much of the combat in Vietnam remains surprisingly low-tech. Helicopters, though pivotal, are high-value targets, and the Viet Cong quickly become adept at shooting them down or ambushing them during vulnerable moments. Their loud rotor noise makes stealth almost impossible, often resulting in ambushes at landing zones using RPGs and heavy machine guns. As one combat account describes, when the troops leaped from the lead choppers, the entire tree line erupted with small arms fire. A machine gun opened up from the hillside north of the LZ, pouring lethal fire into the helicopters. The rounds went smashing into the plexiglass cockpits. One bird rolled over like a great wounded bull elephant, the rotor blades still whirring as they chopped into the earth. The US ultimately loses around 5,000 helicopters during the war, about half of them to enemy fire. To mitigate these risks, helicopters often drop troops in more secure zones, forcing soldiers to undertake long, multi-week jungle patrols, dubbed humping the boonies by GIs. In these conditions, the Viet Cong are not the only adversaries. Wildlife, mosquitoes, disease, exhaustion, and dehydration take a toll on American troops. With only about 1% of patrols encountering enemy forces, mines and booby traps become one of the greatest threats, accounting for roughly a quarter of US casualties. A 19-year-old soldier describes the psychological toll. It's an absurd combination of certainty and uncertainty. The certainty that you're walking in minefields, walking past things day after day. The uncertainty of your every movement, of which way to shift your weight, of where to sit down. When engagements do occur, the Viet Cong almost always initiate the action. A 1966 report estimates that North Vietnamese forces instigate approximately 79% of all attacks. They master predicting the timing of US air support, often retreating before it arrives or engaging so closely that airstrikes risk harming American troops as well. By 1968, an estimated 15 to 20% of US casualties are caused by friendly fire. As one soldier grimly notes, as you come into the village, you always get sniper fire. It never fails, and we invariably take casualties once in a while. We return fire, but by the time we reach the villages, the Viet Cong, VC, have vanished. This constant elusiveness creates significant challenges and frustrations for US troops. Compounding these difficulties, US weapons often perform poorly in Vietnam's jungle environment, particularly the M16 rifle. A study conducted in 1965 reveals an alarming 10.5 malfunctions per 1,000 rounds fired. The M16's lightweight construction is sensitive to variations in ammunition propellant and requires meticulous lubrication, difficult in the harsh, humid conditions. Many soldiers deployed early in the war had no formal training with the M16 before arriving in Vietnam. To address these issues, the Pentagon later introduces modifications, including rust-resistant components and improved training programs. By 1968, the malfunction rate decreased to approximately 3.8 per 1,000 rounds, with serious ejection failures reduced to just 0.32 per 1,000. However, the rifle's initial reputation for unreliability remains, particularly among the Marines. Opinions on the M16 vary widely. When functioning properly, its versatility and firepower boost morale, particularly when mounted on helicopters. Yet detractors argue its reliability declines significantly with wear and tear, and spare parts are often scarce. The rifle's high rate of fire also forces soldiers to carry heavier 7.62 mm ammunition and spare barrels, adding to their physical burdens. For many, these challenges, combined with the stress of combat and the elusive nature of the Viet Cong, lead to a deep sense of frustration, as one soldier recounts. You go out on patrol maybe 20 times or more, and nothing. Just nothing. Then, the 21st time, zap, 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 you get hit, and Victor Charlie fades into the jungle before you can close with him. The pressures on US troops extend far beyond combat encounters. Approximately 25% of the soldiers are draftees, and their average age is only 19. Unlike in previous wars, most American troops do not deploy to Vietnam as part of cohesive units, but as individuals or in small groups. This fragmentation, coupled with high officer turnover and the departure of experienced troops after their tours, prevents the retention of combat knowledge, forcing each new group to relearn critical lessons. The stresses of warfare, a hidden and elusive enemy, and the weight of peer pressure likely contribute to, but do not justify, the instances of violence by American troops against Vietnamese civilians. Over time, the civilian population endures escalating levels of violence, injuries, and property destruction caused by US, ARVN, and allied forces. Intentional or not, such actions further alienate the local population. In many cases, hostility or indifference from villagers leads US soldiers to suspect they support the Viet Cong. Often, this suspicion proves accurate. Even a South Vietnamese government report estimates that around 5 million of the country's 17 million residents sympathize with or directly support the insurgency. This realization erodes the morale and convictions of many US troops, fostering indifference toward the suffering of the local population. Marine Officer Philip Caputo encapsulates this disillusionment. When we marched into the rice paddies, we carried, along with our packs and rifles, the implicit convictions that we were doing something altogether noble and good. We kept the packs and rifles, the convictions we lost. Acts of retaliation against locals often stem from anger over casualties, as well as frustration at the inability to directly strike back at the VC. Daniel Ellsberg, then working for the State Department, observed this firsthand in 1967 while accompanying a patrol that destroyed a civilian home. Reflecting on the incident, he noted, "Their desire to burn the house was in part the result of frustration, and in part reflected the fact that they honestly didn't know what might work." South Vietnamese civilians also endure significant violence at the hands of the Viet Cong. As the war escalated in 1965, support for the VC diminished, prompting them to rely increasingly on coercion and political pressure to secure recruits, supplies, and intelligence. Civilians who have any interaction with US or ARVN troops risk political accusations or denunciations from the Viet Cong. Lali Haislip, a villager in South Vietnam, recounts being attacked by the VC after her loyalty was questioned. She reflects, "After a while, our fear of the Viet Cong was almost as strong as our fear of the Republicans. If the Republicans were like elephants trampling our village, the Viet Cong were like snakes who came at us in the night. At least you can see an elephant coming and get out of the way." The psychological toll and tactical dynamics on the ground resulted in a stalemate by 1967. When US troops engage the enemy on favorable terms, they inflict significant casualties. However, the grinding nature of the conflict exacts a heavy toll on American forces. Meanwhile, North Vietnam's attritional strategy appears to be more effective. Despite this, Westmoreland remains publicly optimistic. By 1967, US troop levels in Vietnam reached 485,600. The Westmoreland requests even more. Large-scale search and destroy operations early in the year, such as Operation Cedar Falls and Junction City, bolster his assertions of progress. The US claims to have killed 2,000 enemy insurgents during these operations, and Westmoreland estimates there are fewer than 242,000 Viet Cong fighters left in South Vietnam. In reality, the situation is far more ambiguous. Many of these metrics are significantly inflated. The reliance on body counts as a primary measure of success incentivizes commanders to exaggerate figures, often doubling them, or even counting civilian deaths as Viet Cong under an unspoken rule. If it's dead in Vietnamese, it's VC. This fixation on quantifiable data sidelines critical, less tangible aspects of warfare, such as morale, ideological support, and civilian attitudes, creating a narrow and flawed understanding of the conflict. The attitude that if it can't be counted, it can't be important, ignores the complex socio-political dimensions of counterinsurgency. The US also underestimates North Vietnam's resilience and capacity to sustain losses. North Vietnam views the conflict as a total people's war aimed at revolutionary unification. The CIA, often critical of the military's statistical methods, estimates there were as many as 600,000 enemy combatants in South Vietnam in 1967, with 200,000 North Vietnamese reaching draft age annually. Despite intense bombing campaigns like Operation Rolling Thunder, which destroys 59% of power stations and 75% of oil storage facilities in North Vietnam, these efforts have minimal impact on an agrarian society with a largely non-mechanized military. Moreover, the costs are staggering. For every dollar of damage caused by US bombing in 1967, the US incurs $9.50 in expenses. The focus on bombing and body counts begins to backfire in other areas. Domestic support for the war declines, and international opinion turns against the US in countries like Sweden, India, and Japan. North Vietnam is increasingly praised for its resistance. By late 1967, Westmoreland and President Johnson embarked on a public relations campaign across the US, aiming to restore confidence in their Vietnam strategy. Westmoreland assures the public, the ranks of the Viet Cong are thinning. The end begins to come into view. However, the events of early 1968 will decisively prove this optimism to be disastrously misplaced.